Hello everyone! In this week's video, we're going to be discussing storyboards, panels, and printing guidelines. I'm going to answer commonly asked questions I see about these subjects. I'm also going to give tips on creating storyboards and adding panels to pages. So let's get started. How many pages should be in a chapter? I see this question a lot, and it's one I often get asked. If you're making this book yourself and there is no publisher or writer, how long each chapter is up to you. How professionals decide is that they are often given a page limit by the publisher, so they have to work with what they are given. I tend to make my chapters shorter because I find it easier to work with short chapters. I usually make mine 15 to 20 pages. Most published mangas have chapters that are 20 to 40 pages. That is what I most commonly see. I've heard it makes the printing process easier if your page count is divisible by 4, so you might want to take that into account. What do the blue lines on manuscript paper mean? So some of you may be wondering, what is manuscript paper? It is basically paper that has printing guidelines on it. These lines help the artist know where they need to place things, like speech bubbles, without them getting cut off in the printing process. So I'm going to be showing some diagrams that I made. I am using Clip Studio Paint for my software, and that's what I use to make my stories. So first, this is the safe area. You want to make sure important things like characters' faces or speech bubbles or anything that is important to the story is kind of within this safe area. Now this is the outer border. Anything drawn outside of this area will be cut off. So you do not want to draw anything important outside of this area. This is just kind of the border area. It is kind of recommended that you keep text within the safe area and not go into the border. But I do often see in mangas that sometimes the dialogue does kind of go into the border a little bit. So it is okay if you have to absolutely have the dialogue slightly go into the outer border. I feel like that's okay, but you do not want to get close to this next area, which is bleed. This is the bleed area. Bleed is basically for printers. When a manga is being printed, it needs to be cut to the correct size. Well, when cutting, the cut isn't always perfect and slightly changes in position. That's when bleed comes into play. The bleed area is the area where the printer will try to cut. So it will be somewhere within this area, so you do not want to put anything important in this area or beyond this area because it will get cut off. So here I am showing, so basically we'll go from this size, and then after it's cut it will go down to this size. We'll only have the safe area and the outer border. So next I have these two pages, and I want to talk about something that I didn't know about for a really long time, and that is that you want to take the binding of the book into consideration. So here we have these two pages. Then we're going to have this green area. Now, I want you to imagine a book, and you know how the pages all come together into the spine, the binding area? Well, sometimes it can be hard to see dialogue and characters when they're really close to the binding area. So what I often see is that in mangas, they actually stop drawing or putting speech bubbles. They keep it within the safe area. So they don't even go into the outer border area on the side that has the spine of the book, or that's the inside of the book. So I'll often see on, say, the right or left hand sides that the panels will go all the way to the edges. But I often notice that on the inside of the book, where the pages are binding, that they often get cut off in the safe area, and that they don't really extend into the binding of the book unless it's kind of like a landscape scene or a scene that they want it to feel really open. So take the binding of the book into consideration when planning your story. It can be really helpful and make it easier for the reader to read it. So you probably don't want to put things like dialogue towards the spine of the book, because then readers will have to like open the book really wide and then like look in the binding of the book. So that's one thing to consider when you are making your panels. How many panels should be on each page? How many panels go on each page varies from artist to artist and sometimes depends on the genre. I've noticed with stories that are highly action oriented, so there's not a ton of dialogue and it's more action than dialogue, I often notice they have more panels per page, usually between 5 and 10 in the more action-y parts. So I guess if you're writing more of an action story and you want things to feel fast-paced and quick, use more panels on a page. So let's say you have an action scene and there's a lot going on. I usually see maybe like 7 or 8 panels used. I was going through some of my mangas and I did see one page that had 10 panels on it, but this doesn't leave a lot of room for dialogue. So if you do use a lot of panels on a page, don't plan to use a lot of dialogue. I would say the normal amount to use on a page is about 5 or so. In more dialogue heavy oriented stories, I usually see about 3 to 6 panels per page. So it really depends, and on pages that are more important or that you want to stick out, maybe only use 1 or 2 panels for that page, or even have a 2-page spread. Some stories like to do a 2-page spread for really big scenes, so it's like one panel goes across 2 pages. So yeah, the panel count kind of depends on what's happening in the story. If there's a lot of action and you want it to feel really quick-paced, maybe use more panels. I wouldn't say, I feel like the max is kind of 10. The panels start to get pretty small at 10, and you don't want to overwhelm the page. I would say, maybe for action scenes, try to stick around like 8 or so. But like I said, I have seen 10, and some stories might even have 11. So just kind of do what feels like isn't too overwhelming for the reader, and just make sure the panels are easy to read. So now for some quick tips I'm going to give. Make sure it's easy to tell which panel to read next. This may seem like a simple tip, but I think it's a good one. So just make sure your panels are clean and easy to read. Don't try to add too many panels and make it overcomplicated. Try to think about where you're trying to guide the eye. So a lot of times it's good to guide the eye in kind of a letter Z-like shape across the page. So yeah, try and make the panels easy to read. This next tip is to ask yourself this question: do you have to draw a face for this panel? Many beginning story makers, including myself, fall into the talking head syndrome when making a comic. This is where all we pretty much see are the characters' heads and pretty much nothing else. I used to do this a lot when I was first making stories. So when storyboarding, ask yourself, do we need to see the character's face, or does it not really matter? And if it doesn't really matter, ask yourself, well, what else could I show instead? Sometimes you can show the character doing some kind of action, or some kind of background element, or even the surrounding area. Sometimes it's good to zoom in on the character and zoom back out on the surrounding area instead of staying zoomed in on the character, because it can get a little boring, and as the artist, it can sometimes be a little boring to just be drawing faces over and over again, and sometimes it's nice to change things up. So it's good to ask yourself, do we need to see the character's face in this panel, or does it not really matter? And for the third tip is your storyboards do not need to look very fancy. So when I first started making storyboards, I would make them pretty fancy, and I would put quite a bit of time into them. I would kind of draw the characters, almost kind of like a rough sketch of them. now I pretty much just draw stick people, and I just try to make each character kind of identifiable to me. So sometimes I'll like draw certain things on the stick character to let me know which character it is. But your storyboards do not have to look very fancy. As long as you understand what's going on, it should be good. And if you're working with someone on the story, maybe make them good enough so that other people can kind of understand what's going on. I know some people, when they make storyboards, they draw stick people, but they'll put like the characters' initials on their head. So like for my story, I have Doris, Annabelle, Chase, and Brayson. So I put like a D on Doris's head and an A on Annabelle's head. And so sometimes people do that when they have to show their storyboards to other people and make sure they understand it. But if you're just making these for yourself, you're pretty much the only person that has to understand them, so they don't have to be very fancy. So now I'm going to storyboard my script. I made this in the previous episode, and I'm going to be taking the dialogue from this and making my storyboard. So first we have this establishing shot of the cave. I decided to have it extend all the way to the edges of each side of the paper. I decided to do this because I wanted the scene to feel really open and like it didn't really have any borders. So I have it extending even into the binding edge of the book, and nothing important is gonna be in the binding edge, so it's okay to have it extend into all edges of the book. That's what I did for that. And then I wanted to establish how the characters are in relation to each other. At first I was just gonna have Tala just by herself, and we weren't really gonna see Ren, but I thought it'd be good to establish how the characters are situated in the scene. So I'm gonna have Tala and Ren sitting next to a fire. The finished panel will probably look a lot more fancy than this one. But this is just to give me an idea of what I want to do. And then since this is our first time seeing Tala, I decided to give a pretty good view of her face. I wanted to kind of make that panel kind of stick out, so we're going to get a nice close-up on her face and her facial features, just so the reader can see what Tala looks like. And then I have Tala talking a bit more in the upper panel. And then in this panel, I decided to have it show only the lower half of Tala's face. A lot of times things will feel more dramatic if we can't fully see the character's face. So I decided to have her just show the lower part of her face. So next we have this panel with Ren, kind of the same thing with Tala. I wanted to make sure we are able to see Ren's face. So I'm drawing the panel kind of bigger so we get more detail on her face. I also made this panel bigger because it's kind of important. Her silence, I guess. I wanted it to kind of stick out the fact that she's not really answering and that she's just kind of silent because she doesn't really know the answer to the question. And if I would have made that panel small, it would have made her silence seem maybe not as important. So I made it bigger just to make her silence seem more important. By making panels bigger, it often makes the action seem more important or stick out a lot more. But if something isn't really important or doesn't really need to stick out very much, you can often just give it smaller panels. But for more important scenes or actions, you want to give it a bigger panel. So that's why I decided on that. So yeah, those are the storyboards for this script. The next episode, I guess, will be on inking and screen tones. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it was helpful to you. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week in my next video. Bye!